The silence, thick and absorbent like felt, was the first thing Elias registered. His breath hitched, a dry, shallow sound that immediately felt too loud against the oppressive quiet of the Magnusson Municipal Library. He lay curled beneath the scratchy weight of a threadbare grey wool blanket, a relic liberated from the staff locker years ago, which smelled perpetually of mothballs and settled dust. The weak light, filtering through the grime-caked Gothic windows above, painted long, fractured stripes across the tessellated marble floor, illuminating the restless dance of unseen motes of dust in the chilled air. Elias was 11 years old, though the constant gnawing of hunger and the permanent shadow beneath his eyes gave his face the sculpted sharpness of a much older boy. He knew every echoing chamber, every creaking floorboard, every peculiar odor of this mausoleum of knowledge. For 3 years, the Magnusson Municipal Library, abandoned after a structural collapse, scare had terrified the city council into condemnation, had been his fortress, his pantry, and his relentless companion in solitude. He unfolded himself slowly, joints popping with the stiffness of the early morning cold. His domain was the reference section, nestled deep within the lower level, where the high, dark mahogany shelving formed a natural, inescapable labyrinth. The air here was heavier, imbued with the deep, earthy scent of decaying lignin and binding glue, the smell of trapped history. His morning ritual was meticulous, dictated by the necessity of survival and the crushing weight of having nothing else to do. First, checking the small cache of canned goods he kept hidden behind the massive, immovable encyclopedia sets. 3 cans of peaches, 2 of beans, holding steady, then the survey of the light. Today, the light was particularly poor, a sullen gunmetal grey filtering through the permanent haze of the city smog and the filth on the glass. He knew instinctively that this meant the temperature would not rise significantly, demanding an early search for kindling. He needed to venture into the deepest, most unstable parts of the structure, the old periodical stacks, sometimes referred to internally as the banned annex, a section sealed off even before the library's final demise, rumoured to hold the text too esoteric or damaged for public view. He rarely dared the annex. The floorboards there were notoriously unsound, groaning not just under his weight, but sometimes seemingly under the sheer atmospheric pressure of the building itself. Elias laced up his boots. They were hand-me-downs, heavy leather, offering excellent protection against the splinters and debris. The noise of the laces scraping through the metal eyelets seemed magnified 10 times in the silence. He navigated the central reading room, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fine, velvety dust that lay everywhere. He ran a finger along the spine of a shelf, pulling back a grey stripe of powder. He often wondered if the dust contained the residue of the forgotten words themselves, the dried ink, the pulverized thoughts of a million readers. The entrance to the annex was not a door, but a gaping breach in a wall of shelving, where a significant portion of the plaster ceiling had collapsed years ago, tearing the structural integrity of the surrounding shelves. He ducked under a leaning beam, the wood splintered and dry, its surface slick with cobwebs thicker than any cotton wool. The air shifted immediately. It became sharp, dry and cold, carrying a distinct metallic smell, perhaps oxidized iron from the internal structure, or simply the smell of absolute desolation. Elias was not looking for anything specific, only material to burn. His eyes scanned the floor for loose scraps of paper, broken chair legs, or anything that didn't hold the invaluable weight of a full book. He never burned full books. That felt like sacrilege, a violation of the only remaining residence of his home. He moved slowly down the narrow aisle marked Occult History 1850 to 1920, running his hands along the shelves, not daring to grip anything too tightly for fear of pulling down an avalanche. The books here were different. They were larger, bound in leathers that had faded to hues of deep oxblood and sickly olive green. Many had straps or clasps, now broken or missing. His attention snagged on a single volume, tucked deeply between two enormous texts on comparative mythologies. It was unusual because of its placement. While most books here sagged against their neighbors, this one was perfectly centered in the gap, as if positioned with specific intent. He hesitated. Curiosity in this environment was often rewarded with injury, but the volume exerted a strange, silent pull. Elias stretched out his arm, wrist stiff, fingertips lightly brushing the binding. The cover was thick, heavy linen, not leather, dyed a dull, uncompromising black. It was utterly devoid of text, no title, no author, no spine markings. It looked like a conceptual void in material form. He gently, painstakingly nudged the adjacent books away. The black volume came free easily. Holding it, Elias registered its impossible weight. It was lighter than it should have been based on its thick dimensions, suggesting an interior that was not filled with pages. He turned it over in his hands. It was the size of a large atlas, but perhaps only an inch and a half thick. The front cover felt rough, almost abrasive, like starched burlap. The edges were sharp and clean, suggesting careful maintenance even through the years of neglect. He could feel no joint where the front cover met the spine, only one continuous, seamless stretch of binding material. Elias sat down on the dusty floor, resting the book carefully on his knees, his heart beating a quick, uneven tattoo against his ribs. He studied the edges again, looking for a seam, a line, anything that suggested an opening mechanism. He tried to lift the front cover. It was fixed, solid. He tried the back, equally solid. It felt like a solid block of wood wrapped in cloth. He brought it closer to his face, breathing in the smell of it, unlike the surrounding books, which smelled overwhelmingly of decay and mold. This one carried a faint, crisp scent, like very old ink that had been pressed flat for decades, mixed with something sharp and metallic, like dried blood or rust. He ran his fingers slowly along the spine. It was unnervingly smooth. It was only when his index finger reached the very top edge of the spine, the head cap, that he felt a faint discontinuity, a sliver of space, barely wider than a piece of thread. With immense care, Elias inserted the corner of his smallest fingernail into the gap. He pressed inward, holding his breath, expecting resistance. There was none. Instead, the top of the spine gave way with a silent, minute click. The front cover, which moments before had felt immovable, now pivoted outwards along the bottom edge, like a drawbridge descending. It didn't drop. It moved with controlled, slow resistance, revealing its true nature, a cleverly hinged lid. The book was not a book. It was a perfectly crafted container. Elias stared into the black, shallow cavity revealed inside. It was lined with a material that looked like faded purple silk, now dust-covered and stiff, and resting within that silk lining was the object. It was not a jewel, nor a key, nor a weapon. It was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of paper, secured with a thin, brittle piece of black ribbon, tied in a perfect, small bow that had flattened with age. Elias felt a profound, unexpected surge of dread, mixed with an intense, agonizing curiosity. This was not the debris of an abandoned place. This was intent. This was a message left for someone, long ago. His hands trembled slightly as he reached inside. The air around the scroll felt colder than the surrounding library air, as if it had been sealed in a vacuum. He pinched the paper between his thumb and forefinger. It was thick, almost parchment-like, stiff and surprisingly heavy. The ribbon snapped instantly under the slightest pressure, dissolving into black dust that settled on the purple silk. Elias carefully unrolled the cylinder, spreading the paper out flat against the backdrop of the hollow book's cover. The paper was covered in tight, precise, elegant handwriting, executed in what looked like fountain pen ink, a deep, permanent black that seemed to absorb the scant light. The text was long. It was not a note. It was a full, meticulously written letter, or perhaps a segment of a journal. Elias began to read, his eyes moving slowly, painfully, adjusting to the precise, slanted cursive. The words were immediately intimate, heavy with emotion, and entirely unexpected. The heading was simply, October 14th, 1978. To the one who finds this, who trespasses in my final sanctuary, I have sealed this where it cannot be easily disturbed, yet where the persistent, the truly lost, might stumble upon it. If you have found the black volume, you are either a ghost of this failing structure or a soul wandering without direction. I hope, profoundly, that you are the latter. My name was Alistair Thorne. I was the chief librarian of Magnusson for 42 years. I wrote this not as a record, but as an act of confession, a penance for a silence that has metastasized into the structure of this building itself. I have held the history of this library in my hands, cataloguing every birth, every death, every great triumph and whispered tragedy that passed through its doors. I prided myself on my memory, my meticulous order, and my commitment to preserving the sacred word. But order is a lie. Order is the quiet veneer we paint over chaos to survive the day. And my chaos was singular, total, and irreversible. It happened here, in the heart of the stacks, 6 weeks before the public discovered the foundation fault, the fabricated crisis used to justify our closure. The true catastrophe was quieter, more localized, and entirely my fault. Elias felt a coldness spread across his chest, a deep internal chill that had nothing to do with the library's temperature. The man writing this, Alistair Thorne, was not just some distant figure. He felt immediate, his grief palpable through the decades-old ink. Elias adjusted his position, shifting the book closer to the fading light. He needed every word. He had been taught that the library was condemned due to shifting ground. Now, a man was telling him the truth was darker, wrapped in a personal catastrophic failure. I had a son. His name was Thomas. You would never have met him. He was spirited, wildly imaginative, profoundly restless. He saw the library not as a repository of rules, but as a map of infinite possible worlds. He was 10 years old, exactly the age when the world begins to solidify into harsh geometry, and he fought that solidification with every ounce of his being. Thomas was, regrettably, unsupervised. I was entrenched in my office, managing the inventory audit, convinced that my duty to the printed word superseded my duty to the living one. A fatal error in judgment, one I replay every night when the cold drafts of the stack aisles whisper their accusations. He loved the annex. He called it the sunken ship. He would sneak down here against my strict instructions, lured by the forbidden titles, by the promise of secrets. On that afternoon, September 3rd, 1978, he found something he shouldn't have. He didn't find a demon or a curse. He found a structural truth. The annex was not just old, it was actively failing. There was a section of floor beneath the occult history shelves that had been compromised by a slow, unnoticed leak from the aging pipes above. Thomas, being small and light, likely didn't even realize the danger until the shift began. Elias's eyes flickered down to the dusty, uneven floor beneath his own boots. He felt the cold pressure of the stone, suddenly mindful of the emptiness beneath the surface. I heard the sound. Not the sound of books falling, but the deeper, gut-wrenching sound of wood fiber giving way, of plaster exploding, of stone shifting on stone. I ran, faster than I had run in 20 years. When I reached the breach, I saw it. The entire aisle, the very one where you sit now, I suspect, had pitched violently inward. A tidal wave of books, volumes that represented centuries of human effort, had cascaded down, burying the compromised section under an overwhelming, crushing weight. And Thomas was caught in the worst of it. It took 2 hours for the emergency services to reach him, 2 hours of frantic, brutal digging by me, alone, before the first firemen arrived. They warned me about the instability, but I couldn't stop. I was digging through my life, through my failure, through the physical manifestations of my pride. When they finally lifted the last heavy volume, the enormous leather-bound atlas of forgotten stars, Thomas was gone. Not physically gone, but silenced. The weight had been too great. The silence that fell then was the silence that has never left this building. It swallowed the noise of the city, the chirping of the alarms, even the sound of my own despair. Elias paused, pulling his blanket tighter around his shoulders, despite the lack of physical cold. The drama was not external. It was internal. He was not reading history. He was witnessing a man's confession of losing his child in the very walls that now sheltered Elias. The intensity of Alistair Thorne's grief was overwhelming, reaching across the decades. Elias felt an unexpected kinship with Thomas, a boy of 10 who loved the annex, who sought secrets in the dark corners. He continued reading, the black ink flowing like a slow, deliberate poison onto the page. I realized then that the library, my beloved Magnusson, had killed my son, and I, its warden, had allowed it. The structural problems were real, but they were minor. The collapse here was contained, a localized tragedy that should have been managed privately. But I couldn't face the truth. I couldn't face the report that would reveal I had let my child play in the ruins. So I engineered a cover-up. I used my position, my network, my meticulous knowledge of the building's weak points. I exaggerated the foundation fault to the city planning committee. I planted false structural reports. I sealed the annex and spread the rumor of the general instability. I needed the library closed. I needed it silent, preserved exactly as it was, as Thomas's final resting place. This was my selfish monument. I condemned this magnificent structure and exiled the word, simply because I couldn't bear to see this room scrubbed clean, the terrible memory erased by public renovation. I knew I couldn't live without the library, and yet I couldn't live within its functioning reality. I stayed, becoming the ghost I always feared. I lived out my remaining few years here, maintaining the illusion of order, dusting the spines, feeling Thomas's small, absent weight in every corner. I crafted this hollow book to hold the true inventory, not of the library's contents, but of its curse. This is the truth I must leave behind, because silence, when it is motivated by fear, is the most corrosive acid in the human spirit. The weight of the parchment felt heavier in Elias's hands. This was not just a sad story. This explained the unnatural stillness of the building, the air of perpetual guilt that seemed to saturate the marble and the wood. But there is a specific reason I committed these words to paper, beyond my own need for absolution. It concerns the finality of Thomas's resting place. He died holding a book. It wasn't one of the heavy atlases that crushed him, but a small, unassuming volume he had found moments before the collapse. It was a blank notebook, a Commonplace Book, where he recorded his observations about the hidden life of the library. His observations were strangely accurate, precocious, often revealing more about the structural integrity than my own engineering reports. When we recovered him, the notebook was clutched so tightly in his right hand that the paramedics couldn't pry it loose without causing damage. I took it. I couldn't bear the thought of it being logged as evidence or, worse, tossed away. I knew, somehow, that this notebook was his last breath, his final communication. It contained drawings of the cracks, notes on the persistent dripping sound he heard, and, most importantly, a meticulously drawn map detailing the location of his hidden treasures, small coins, marble fragments, and a locket he had found in the staff refuse. I sealed the notebook away, not here, but in a place that only the truly devoted would ever find, a place that requires not just curiosity, but profound, desperate need. Elias's chest tightened. He was the truly devoted. He was the one who was profoundly desperate. This narrative was reaching across time, pointing directly at him. If you are the one reading this, you are a soul who has claimed the Magnusson Library as your own, just as Thomas and I did. You share the dust, the cold, and the silence. And if you are wandering, perhaps Thomas's last words can offer you the direction I failed to give him. The Commonplace Book is hidden in the oldest section of the facility, the Archives Annex, behind the main ledger cage. Specifically, it is placed inside the cavity left by the missing first volume of the Dewey Decimal Catalogue. The DDC has 12 volumes. The first is missing. Inside that gap, I placed the small, heavy book of Thomas's final observations. Go there, find his voice, and if you find a coin among the contents, a tarnished halfpenny dated 1901, please take it out into the light. Do not spend it. Just let the sun touch it again. It was the first thing Thomas ever hid in these walls, and it deserves to feel the warmth of the world one last time. My time grows short. The library is cold, and the silence is consuming me. May the word provide you the sanctuary it failed to provide my son. Alistair Thorne. Elias finished reading. The paper held loosely in his hands suddenly felt like a map, a burden, and a precious, fragile gift all at once. His reality, the simple, predictable, dust-filled routine of survival, had just been irrevocably shattered. The library was no longer a tomb, it was a memorial, haunted not by malicious spirits, but by the profound, agonizing grief of a father. The intense shock gave way to a cold, focused urgency. The text explicitly prohibited him from simply surviving in the ruins. It demanded an emotional action, the retrieval of Thomas's voice, the carrying of the coin into the sun. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the hollow of the black volume. The silence of the annex pressed in on him, but now it felt different, less empty, more expectant. The Archives Annex. That area was known to be the most structurally sound, paradoxically, because it was built of thicker stone meant to protect irreplaceable records. It was located on the ground floor, far from his current subterranean sanctuary. Elias rose slowly, his legs stiff. The movement caused a flurry of dust to rise and swirl in the faint light. He clutched the black volume tightly against his chest, feeling the sharp, clean edges of the binding pressing into his ribs. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not leave this task unfinished. This was the first time in 3 years he had a true external objective. He began the long, silent journey out of the periodical stacks. The journey was not an easy sprint. It was a meticulous traverse across the ruined landscape of the main floor. Elias moved like a shadow, hugging the perimeter walls, where the structure was typically strongest. He was acutely aware of the risk now. If the library had already killed one 10-year-old, it would not hesitate to claim another. He passed through the circulation desk area, where the heavy oak counter was warped and half collapsed, and the brass filing system lay scattered like metallic bones. The light here was slightly better, filtered through the enormous main windows that faced the street, offering a tantalizing yet inaccessible view of the outside world. The Archives Annex was sealed behind a heavy, fire-rated door, secured by a solid, rusted bolt. Elias had never managed to budget. Alistair Thorne, however, had worked here for decades. He would have known another way in. Elias stopped, remembering the letter's emphasis on meticulous order and hidden vulnerabilities. He ran his hand along the plaster wall adjacent to the sealed door. It felt cold, dense, but his fingers registered a slight difference in texture near the baseboard. He knelt, tracing the line of the wall with obsessive care. 3 feet from the doorframe, he felt it, a hairline fracture covered by years of paint and dust, but distinct under his probing fingertip. He pushed lightly. A section of the baseboard, no more than 6 inches high, shifted inward, revealing a gap that ran the entire width of the door. It was a maintenance access panel, perfectly disguised. The dust had settled into the seam, effectively sealing it until now. Elias inserted his pocket knife, a small, dull instrument he used primarily for opening cans, into the gap and levered gently. The panel squeaked in protest, then swung inward, revealing a dark, claustrophobic crawl space, barely large enough for his body. The air that rushed out was stale, incredibly dry, and smelled intensely of ozone and old electricity, the remnants of the annex's old climate control systems. He slipped the black volume into the pouch he wore slung across his chest, a salvaged canvas bag, used for carrying his meager provisions. He lowered himself carefully into the space. The crawl was short, perhaps only 15 feet, but terrifyingly dark. Elias had to move by touch, trusting that the base of the wall was stable. He scraped his elbows raw against the rough stone. The silence here was different from the stacks. It was a heavy, pressured silence, the silence of deeply buried vaults. After what felt like an eternity, his probing hands found another seam, another panel, which pushed outward into the archive's annex. He tumbled silently onto a cold, polished wooden floor. The archives were magnificent in their preservation. Unlike the public areas, this room was a climate-controlled box, and the decay here was minimal. The air was clean, faintly smelling of lavender polish and aged parchment. Massive steel shelves, taller than any man, lined the walls, filled not with paperbacks, but with ledgers, maps, and document boxes, all perfectly aligned. The centerpiece was the main ledger cage, a three-sided structure of thick, dark metal mesh, designed to protect the most sensitive materials. Elias moved toward it, his heart hammering against the black volume in his pouch. The instruction was clear. The cavity left by the missing first volume of the Dewey Decimal Catalogue. He located the DDC shelf immediately. It was a conspicuous sight, a series of 12 heavy, uniform, blue cloth-bound books resting vertically. But there were only 11 books. The gap where the first volume should have rested was starkly empty. Elias approached the gap. It wasn't a perfect space. The books had slumped slightly, pressing against the area where the missing volume should have been. He used his shoulder to gently brace the 11th volume, creating enough room to inspect the emptiness. The back of the shelf seemed solid, but the depth of the gap felt too profound. He reached inside, his fingertips brushing the rough, exposed particle board of the shelf. He pressed, searching for the telltale hinge, the disguised panel Alistair Thorne had favored. Nothing. Just dusty wood. Elias pulled his hand out, frustrated, and looked at the 11 blue volumes. He reread the mental inventory of the letter, placed inside the cavity left by the missing first volume. He realized his mistake. He wasn't looking for a secret compartment in the shelf itself. He was looking for the item using the gap. He reached back in and extended his arm further, beyond the normal reach of a reader. His fingers grazed something metallic, rough, and slightly cold. He wiggled his fingers, grasping the object. It was small, rectangular, and surprisingly heavy. He pulled it out. It was a small, heavy book, bound not in leather, but in a thick, durable canvas that had faded to a mottled, indeterminate shade of green. It was secured by a single, narrow, elastic strap, long since slackened and useless. The Commonplace Book, Thomas's final testament. Elias held it tightly. This was the voice he had been seeking, the secret heart of the abandoned library. The urgency in the moment was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotional significance. He didn't dare open it in the dim, pressured silence of the archives. He needed to be back in the familiar decaying light of the main stacks, where the air was freer and the memories less dense. He retreated the way he came, crawling back through the narrow maintenance shaft, the small green book tucked safely into his pouch, resting next to the heavier black volume. Once back in the reference section, settled on his worn wool blanket, Elias performed a meticulous examination of the Commonplace Book. It was the size of a modern paperback, thick with heavy-gauge paper. He opened the cover. The first page was a meticulously drawn title page, penned in a childish but serious hand. The Observations of T. Thorne, Confidential Index of the Magnusson Library's Secret Life, age 10. The subsequent pages were a fascinating, heartbreaking blend of a child's imagination and a surveyor's precision. Page 1. The North Wing Leak, a detailed cross-section drawing of the library's north wall, showing a subtle fissure in the pipe system near the third-floor restroom. Thomas had carefully noted the speed of the drip, the discoloration of the ceiling panel below, and the exact time the drip was loudest. Observation. Slow, but relentless. Dad says the library is just settling. I think the library is crying. Page 10. The third stack's echo, a diagram detailing how sound traveled within the central stacks. Thomas hypothesized that the specific arrangement of the highest, heaviest shelves created a natural sound vacuum. Hypothesis: if you speak too loud, the silence rushes in to eat your words. Elias spent hours traversing the pages, utterly absorbed. The text wasn't a mystery novel. It was a profound insight into a lonely, intelligent child who had tried to rationalize and document his world. Then he came to the section marked The Basement Anomaly. This began on page 47, September 1st. Dad told me not to go to the annex. I went anyway. It feels important there, like the oldest memories are kept there. I found a strange spot under the occult history shelves. The floor feels soft, not rotten wood soft, but almost springy, like the stone has come loose from the earth beneath it. I pushed on it with my heel. It gave a little. There is a persistent drip sound coming from very close. Drawing 47A. Cross-section of the unstable floor beneath shelf 9. The drawing was precise, showing the floorboards resting on a visibly cracked support beam. Thomas had noted the angle of the crack and the color of the water staining the wood, a reddish-brown like weak tea. Elias recognized the exact location. It was where he had retrieved the black volume just hours before, the spot where Thomas met his end. Reading the notes, witnessing the boy's calm, scientific documentation of his own imminent tragedy, was unbearable. Elias felt a profound retroactive terror for Thomas. He wasn't reckless. He was simply investigating, applying the curiosity the library was supposed to foster. Elias continued, his fingers occasionally tracing the lines of Thomas's small, carefully formed handwriting. The final entry was short, executed in a shaky, quick pencil script rather than the usual careful ink. It occupied only the top half of page 55. September 3rd. It is loud here today. The drip is faster. I found the lockbox, hidden inside the space where the wall meets the floor, under the shifting stone. Dad never finds my spots. Inside I put my treasures, the marble, the stone with the gold flakes and the half-penny. I think the shelf is leaning. I hear it groaning like a boat in a storm. I need to go. The page abruptly ended. There was a smear of black ink across the bottom margin, and then a faint, almost invisible brown stain, the color of rust, or perhaps the blood Alistair Thorne had smelled in the binding of the black volume. Elias closed the Commonplace Book slowly. The information had been given to him. Thomas's secret cache, the final destination of his childhood treasures, located just feet away from where Elias was currently sitting. The instruction from Alistair Thorne echoed in his mind. If you find a coin among the contents, a tarnished halfpenny dated 1901, please take it out into the light. Do not spend it. Just let the sun touch it again. The coin. The act of bringing the coin into the light was the final critical step. It was the emotional climax, the release of the long-held grief. Elias realized the profound implication. He had to leave the library. He had lived in absolute fear of the outside world, equating the exterior with cold, aggressive judgment and danger. The library was safe because it was forgotten. To step outside, to willingly expose himself to the sun, to the possibility of being seen, was an act of terrible vulnerability. But this was no longer about his own survival. It was about fulfilling the final wish of a grieving father and honoring the last memory of a lost boy who loved this dark place too much. The urgency was now personal, a moral imperative. Elias returned to the annex, this time moving with swift, determined efficiency. He located the exact shelf described in Thomas's notebook, Shelf 9, Occult History. He knelt, running his hand along the dusty stone floor. Thomas mentioned a lockbox hidden where the wall met the floor, under the shifting stone. The description was vague, but Elias understood Thomas's logic. If the stone was shifting, it meant a gap. He began clearing the debris in that corner. Minutes passed, filled only with the scraping sound of his hands moving dust and broken plaster, and then his fingers found it. Not a lockbox, but a thick, square tile of stone, slightly recessed and loose. It was maybe 6 inches across. Elias inserted the blade of his pocketknife into the seam and levered up. The stone popped out with a dry, grinding sound, revealing a shallow, perfect cube of darkness beneath. The cache was just as Thomas had described, a collection of items wrapped in a piece of stiff, faded calico cloth. Elias lifted the package out. The contents shifted inside, making a dull, low, rattling sound. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay 3 objects. 1, a perfectly smooth, dark blue glass marble, chipped in one place. 2, a small, water-smoothed piece of riverstone, veined with flecks that genuinely shimmered gold in the library's weak light. 3, and resting right on top, the coin. It was exactly as Alistair Thorne had described, a halfpenny, tarnished to a deep, nearly black patina, dated 1901. It was tiny, almost swallowed by Elias's palm, but weighted with unimaginable history. He stared at the coin, feeling the rough texture of the aged metal against his skin. This small piece of copper, older than the library itself, represented the last piece of Thomas Thorne's childhood innocence. The task was clear. He had to take it outside. Elias carefully rewrapped the marble and the gold-flecked stone, tucking them back into the cache, and replaced the stone tile lid. He sealed the memory, taking only the necessary instrument of his ritual. He stood up, the halfpenny clutched tightly in his fist. The journey to the main doors was the hardest Elias had ever undertaken. The doors were grand, heavy slabs of bronze and oak, sealed by internal bolts and external chains since the condemnation. Elias knew the structure of the lock system intimately. It was designed to keep people out, but there was a release mechanism meant for custodial staff in an emergency, a heavy lever disguised within the high, ornate woodwork of the foyer. He climbed the internal staircase, moving up toward the relentless judging light. The foyer was the most exposed part of the library, the giant glass-paned doors offering a full, terrifying view of the bustling street. He reached the lever, pulling himself up onto the molding. The mechanism was stiff with rust and neglect. Elias grunted, pushing with all his meager 11-year-old strength. The lever squealed, vibrating throughout the massive doors. A sequence of loud, grating clicks echoed through the foyer as the internal bolts retracted. He dropped to the floor, panting. The external chains, however, were still locked. He walked to the main doors, placing his hand against the cold, smooth wood. He could hear the muffled, busy sound of the city on the other side, the grinding of distant traffic, the shouts of passers-by, the aggressive, overwhelming noise of life continuing without him. He reached into his pocket for the halfpenny. This was the moment of total vulnerability. He had to open the doors, even if only slightly, to let the coin feel the sun. He pushed the right-hand door with his shoulder. The external chain pulled taut with a loud, metallic screech, only allowing a gap of about 6 inches, just enough to create a sliver of contact with the world. A shocking blast of fresh, cold air rushed in, smelling of ozone, vehicle exhaust, and autumn leaves. a complex, vibrant scent that instantly overwhelmed the musty odor of the library. Elias shielded his eyes against the sudden, brutal intrusion of light. It was late afternoon, and the sun was low, throwing long, dazzling gold spears across the street. He stuck his arm out through the narrow gap, extending his hand into the world outside. He forced his fist open, revealing the dull, black halfpenny resting on his palm. He held it there. The sun hit the coin. It wasn't a flash of magic or a sudden, brilliant shine. It was a slow, gradual revelation. As the direct sunlight washed over the metal, the centuries of grime and tarnish seemed to absorb the light first. Then, slowly, infinitesimally, the subtle copper hue underneath began to respond. The coin didn't glitter, but it began to warm. Elias felt the heat of the sun on his wrist, a sensation so foreign and powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. And he felt the coin growing warm against his skin, absorbing the energy it had been denied for decades. He stood there motionless, his face pressed against the gap in the massive door, watching the silent, golden communication between the coin and the celestial body. He was allowing a ghost's last wish to be fulfilled. He was acting as the conduit for a father's painful, overwhelming love. Tears, hot and unexpected, tracked clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. They were not tears of sadness for himself, but tears of release for the thorns. He held the coin there for a long time, watching the light change as the sun slowly dipped toward the city skyline. The halfpenny was now truly warm, retaining the heat of the world outside. Elias closed the door, allowing the external chain to pull taut with a muffled clang, sealing the library once more. He did not re-engage the internal bolts. That felt like unnecessary fear now. He walked back into the deeper shadows of the library, the halfpenny still hot in his hand. The sense of isolation was still present, but the nature of that isolation had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a personal punishment. It was a chosen sanctuary, now imbued with the heavy, precious history of a shared loss and a hidden connection. He returned to the reference section, sitting back down beneath his blanket. He laid the two books, the black volume and the Commonplace Book, side by side. They were physical anchors to a past he now carried. He kept the halfpenny, placing it on the floor beside his sleeping mat, a tiny warm beacon in the overwhelming cold. The emotional drainage was enormous. The urgency, the fear, the discovery, and the profound act of breaking his self-imposed quarantine to fulfill a moral duty had exhausted him. He lay down, the silence of the library once again pressing in. But tonight, the silence was different. It felt less like a vacuum and more like a gentle, profound embrace. He wasn't Elias, the nameless trapped boy. He was Elias, the caretaker of Thomas's memory and the reluctant confessor of Alistair Thorne. He had a connection now, a purpose rooted not in survival, but in the preservation of human vulnerability and sorrow. He realized the library had not been his home merely by accident. It had drawn him in, a solitary, sensitive boy, to eventually become the one who could finally close the loop of an old, devastating family tragedy. He reached out and gently touched the worn cover of Thomas's Commonplace Book. He felt the cold air settle around him, but the warmth of the coin, radiating from the floor, seemed enough to hold the darkness at bay. Elias drifted into sleep, the smell of old paper and distant rain, a familiar lullaby. He knew that tomorrow the routine would be different. He had a lineage now. He was part of the Magnusson Library's secret, devastating history. And in the heart of its silence, he had finally found a profound, undeniable sense of belonging. The loneliness was still vast, but it was no longer singular. It was shared. He was Thomas's ghost, tending to Alistair's memory, sheltered by the weight of the abandoned word. His home, once a prison of necessity, was now a monument of love.